Welcome all to the day 2 of the workshop on development, evaluation, and reporting strategies of AI algorithms in maternal and child health, a joint initiative of THSTI and University of Oxford. Yesterday, we had Professor Abu Hamad discuss the role of ultrasound imaging in MCH. And on that note, we move to the first part of our workshop focused on development. And in order to coordinate this session, I invite once again Professor of Fetal Medicine and Director of Clinical Research of Oxford Maternal and Perinatal Health Institute, Professor Aris Papageorghiou. I also welcome as co-chair Dr. Khurana, a renowned radiologist and fetal medicine expert with over 30 years of experience in ultrasound imaging and the leader of Society of Fetal Medicine in India. Welcome, sir. Over to you, Dr. Aris and Dr. Khurana.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Ashok, good morning.
Hi.
I'd love to have, I hope, we look forward to this discussion panel this morning, which is all about setting up clinical studies in order to develop, really, models for AI. We've got a fantastic panel before us from varied disciplines. Ram is a researcher at Carbini at THSTI, who is working on, in particular, prediction modeling for adverse outcomes in pregnancy. We've got Professor Fergus Gleeson from Oxford University. Fergus is a radiologist, and he's the head of radiology, has an intense interest in particular MRI, but also in particular prediction modeling for oncological disease. And Fergus, you can explain a little more what you do in detail, I'm sure. Dr. Sethi, who's a clinician and scientist with a background in computers and digital health, and Alice, who's a clinical fellow at Women's and Reproductive Health, who has been working on the development of automated or semi-automated or assistive tools for basic obstetric ultrasound in for regions where we have less access to imaging, and as part of the Colopus project. And Ashok, I will let you introduce yourself as co-chair.
I'm from India and I'm a radiologist. As you just heard, it's not 30 years, it's 40 years of work with radiology and imaging. And I shifted over to the kind of work we're doing gradually, trying to see whether we can find low-cost alternatives to lack of human beings in the field. And we seem to be heading in that direction. We have hurdles, which we will discuss later. But let's go ahead with this afternoon. I'm looking forward to an hour of lots of input.
So the reason that we have this discussion for is really to encourage everyone to ask lots of questions from our expert panel. But I thought in order to get the discussion going, I asked the panel very kindly to propose a short opening statement. And if that's okay with you, Ram, I'm going to get you to start with your opening statement, which was about how we can, when we design these studies, we need to start thinking already at the design stage about eventual implementation. So please know what you think about that.
Thank you. Thank you, Aris. Thank you, Dr. Khurana. So may I put up a slide just to give a summary of that?
Why not? Why not? There's no rules for this game, so we'll make them up as we go along.
Yeah. So I think most of my comments will be, it's common for any kind of clinical research one would want to do, which is setting, looking at the context right at the beginning, from the point of conceiving a research question till the end of study and outreach also. But when it comes to AI, it becomes more important because we are dealing with people, interdisciplinary, truly interdisciplinary people, in terms the one group doesn't know the world, may not know the world of the others. And the target population that we are looking at, the stakeholders whom we are looking at may be completely entirely different from the knowledge and experiences that the developers would have. So in that setting, So I think there is a element of context right at the beginning of thing, which is primarily the research question. So what is it that we are trying to predict? Are we trying to solve a problem which actually matters at the ground level in terms of hands of clinicians and the patients? So that's the first context that I think we should think in. And when we are proposing our research question, I think there is a lot translation between different disciplines, and to be on board with respect to what we are trying to ask. I think that has to be one of the primary exercises before we start implementing our this thing and study. And when it comes to design, there are many elements, but then all are with respect to study design. Say, for example, I would say when we are trying to develop a prediction model based on AI, when to predict becomes an important question in a course of illness. And say, for example, if I take an example from maternal child health, I would rather post my question or my prediction model at a time when there is a contact between the patient and the caregiving team. So those kind of small contexts and these kind of schedules and the already existing health systems might vary with different contexts. And that's something which we should think about. And when it comes to the other three elements, which is conduct of study, data analysis, reporting, and outreach, I think there has to be a constant engagement right from the beginning with all stakeholders, including the regulators, as well as people who are conducting the study. And because that's going to enable us putting in our methods right so that it can be easily done at the ground level. And when it comes to reporting, not everyone understands the metrics that comes from data science outputs, and that may not matter also for an end user. For a clinician or for a patient, the metrics that they would want to understand, they would like to see something that has to be built in while we are conceiving and designing the study. I think I'll stop with this at this level. I'll be able to take specific questions later on. Thank you, Aris.
Thank you so much, Ram, for outlining the whole cycle in some way in this opening statement, but also highlighting the importance of thinking about these issues right from the outset. And I do think that is important because, of course, the implementation phase is often where things slow down a little bit. I'm going to turn to Dr. Sethi, since we are on a kind of quasi philosophical discussion. Dr. Sethi, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the perceptual elements of this that you mentioned in your opening statement. Please go ahead.
Dr. Aris. Thank you for having me here, and thank you, Dr. Khurana, also for setting up the lovely discussion. So what I would like to state is that an often recognized but less implemented phase of the design of AI algorithms is how do we actually encode or represent the existing knowledge about the setting, the data, the context that in that we will be actually deploying these models. And representing existing knowledge is important from many standpoints because it could solve a lot of issues about change of context, concept drift. We see that happening in most of the AI models. We start with a model over a period of time, our concepts get outdated. So, and we do think about AI models as having capabilities to encode some of that knowledge in a way where we call that representation learning. Essentially, how do we not only use AI development or model development to discriminate between outcomes, but also to train models that somehow encapsulate the joint distribution that captures how this knowledge of medicine or how the concepts actually come together. And essentially that means that we shift our focus at very initial stages a little bit away from developing models that are predictive from the start. Let's also pay some attention at the beginning to the models that also capture these kind of underlying latent knowledge about the settings, the data, etc. And then there is a bunch of techniques, AI methods, starting from older generation methods such as Bayesian networks that allow you to represent knowledge and to build from there, to state-of-the-art representation learning models that, for example, the autoencoder models or the generative models, which encode this knowledge. The advantage in doing this is from the very start, we have a model that you can interact with the clinician from the start. So because we are not predicting something, we are looking at how the underlying knowledge can be captured. And that allows a lot of explainability to be built into the models, because now the clinicians are able to interact with the model, see how new samples or new data points are generated, irrespective of outcomes. And that builds more trust as you build the model further. And that insight, I believe, the cycle, which Ram also mentioned about, I'm just going deeper into one of these algorithm development cycles, perhaps, where in our experience, we have found that to be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating take. And I'm going to move on to Fergus now, because what you brought up, actually, this interaction between the algorithmic side and the clinician side is a really core issue, both in the development phase, but also in the validation phase. Now, Fergus, apart from your clinical interests, obviously, in radiology, you're also heading the trials unit at the university. And I know that you're doing a huge amount of work in machine learning aspects related to radiology. Share with us a little bit this issue of how clinicians and how we can, I guess, make best value of clinicians, both in terms of the development phase and the validation phase of some of the models that we're building, and how that can post.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for asking me to be part of the panel. It's already really interesting, so thank you for that. A bit of background, I basically look at pictures and spot dots. That's what I do for a living. And the reason I make it that simple, I used to stick pins in the dots when I didn't know what they were, but now younger people do that for me. But the reason for mentioning it is that when an algorithm has been developed and you want to validate it so it's of use in the clinical setting, you need to approach it in the same way that you would a pharmaceutical. And for those of you that have ever been involved in drug trials, the quality control in a drug trial demanded by the regulatory authorities is incredible. And because AI is, if you like, an unknown quantity to most of the regulators, they're getting better, but they're learning this as they go along. They hadn't really, and the algorithm developers haven't really concentrated on the quality of the humans involved in the studies. So if you are going to be at the hard end of algorithm development, which is not detection or measurement, but diagnosis, and attempting to do what humans do quite well, make knowledge and then produce an answer, you need to quality control the humans that you are comparing your algorithm to. And actually, that's really difficult. It's difficult for two reasons. One, it's not actually done. And two, humans, doctors and nurses and clinicians don't like it. They don't like to be measured. That's why there's such a lot of resistance to comparing one doctor with another doctor or one hospital to another hospital, because that implies someone's going to be better than someone else. And actually, nobody. I mean, it's fine if you're Usain Bolt or whatever it is, and you think you're going to be the best, but no one likes to come second or third. So my role in designing these clinical studies, and we're running a prospective study comparing an algorithm that's been developed by a company called Optellum from Oxford against humans to determine, and the humans are using the British Thoracic Society guidelines, and we are determining whether the algorithm is better at predicting whether a nodule that might be a lung cancer can be discharged, the patient can be discharged, followed up, biopsied, etc., by comparing it in real time, having quality controls the hospitals and the doctors involved. So when you see, when I chat about this and give talks, I always suggest that the algorithms, the papers that are published say this algorithm did this or that was better than the 10 doctors, but there is never a mention of how they've assessed how good the doctors are. And that's what you need to look at in that end, because the algorithms should be better than some doctors at some things or some nurses at some things. And the reason why that's important is, as an end user, if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at a CT screen, deciding whether I believe the algorithm that is lung cancer or whatever it is, I need to know how good I am at diagnosing lung cancers. And at the moment, I have no idea at all. No one's ever asked me. I've never been measured. No one in the country has been measured to know how good they are at detecting or diagnosing them, because there isn't anything out there to do it. So my recommendation, whenever you read or whenever you design these trials and you read about them, is look at the human quality control and then think, how would they apply this algorithm would they apply it all the time, some of the time, never in patients with disease in the upper lobe? How do they know when it's better than them? And that relates to quality control.
This is fantastic, Fergus, and I think you're pushing at an open door in, obviously in a different discipline in maternal and child health, in that we use mostly ultrasound, which is notoriously operator dependent. And as you rightly say, the measurement of operators is not done. But what we do know from our studies, where we compare the algorithm to humans, is that the agreement between two radiologists, two sonographers, in diagnosis of, whether this plane is an adequate plane for imaging, for instance, is far from 100%. From 100%. So, and if you have an AI algorithm that's asked to decide whether a plane is or is not, it can either agree with one radiologist or with the other radiologist. It can't agree with both if they're not agreeing between each other. So that element of reproducibility, of inter-observer agreement in a sense, which is a really basic concept in science, is something that grappling with as well, both in the validation, but also in the building of the models, because of course, when you're building the models, you also need ground truth. And the question is, well, what is ground truth? If two operators are not agreeing between each other, whether it is or it isn't. Alice.
Yes, it was great to hear what you had to share, Fergus. Thank you. That is very definitely one aspect of what I've really been grappling with over the last few years of this project. And there are a few points that I wanted to consider really in light of how do we ensure that the data is of the optimal quality. So I think I will mention about the annotation side and the reproducibility in that regard, but also wanted to mention a few points, very practically speaking, I think, about how we acquire our data as well. And so I've been thinking a lot about standardization, whether it's from thinking about, in our context, the speed of the scans that are performed, the ultrasound settings that are used to try and make sure that there's similar quality amongst a multi-site group of people collecting data. I think it's also important when you start off your study to be thinking issues and things that may have arisen when you've been acquiring the data. So whether it's that videos are failing to record, sweeps aren't being performed in a standardized way, or your data isn't being collected in a standardized way, whether you're in our context where we've got things like frames freezing and that sort of thing. And also just trying to make sure that as much of that you try and automate as early on as possible from the start of your study. So because it can require a huge amount of human manpower to watch all of these videos, and there are actually ways that you can automate from the start. how to check whether videos are missing or sweeps are being done at the wrong speed. And then just also very practically speaking, making sure that your data is stored in a way that's very easily accessible, that the names of files and things that you're storing aren't just sort of very uniform and could easily get mixed up if the folders get confused or anything, but just those really practical things that mean that your data is more accessible. So that's sort of the acquisition side, but then coming back to what we've just been hearing about, in terms of how you actually perform your annotations, essentially from the data that you collect participants, how do you then get to data points that you're going to be able to feed into a model? I've been thinking a lot about the standardization of that. How do we work out what is the baseline level of agreement when there isn't a ground truth? You know, ultrasound planes are not uniform, even sort of less so than CTR or MRI. A fetus in the abdomen can be in all sorts of different positions. How on earth do I agree with Aris, for example, that the view that we're seeing is abdomen versus a bit of the pelvis, and how do you then perform those labels? And if we want a machine to learn how to label different parts of fetal anatomy, if Aris and I disagree, as we say, how on earth can we expect a model to? So I think it's really important that you always perform those baseline checks on your data. It's not to say that I'm right and Aris is wrong, or Aris is right and I'm wrong, but that we actually need to just understand what our baseline levels of agreement are, because we can't really expect a model to do better than we can. And then within that question, you've got the challenge of, well, what metrics are we actually going to measure to assess that level of agreement? And I think we found with our work that metric that you can use to say, right, if we put exactly the same thing on the same frame, that's a good level of agreement. There's actually then agreement at all sorts of different levels, depending on whether you've just given a piece of data a label, or whether you've actually had to segment or annotate in some further way. And then there are different ways that you can look at that data to assess the level of agreement.
Thank you, Alice. And just to say, first of all, I would never disagree with what you say. And second, to say, if we did disagree, you would be right and I would be wrong. But I think the important differential here from what Fergus has been talking about, which is a biopsy proven yes or no, this is a diagnosis, in some sense is a different problem, because we have a ground truth, which is histopathology, as opposed to the problem that Alice is talking about, which is screening, which is a different thing. Is in some way quality control screening, and that, you know, in our case it's obstetric ultrasound screening, but it could be aortic aneurysm screening, it could be mammography. It's not just about are you making the diagnosis or not, but are you screening adequately the entirety of your population? And these are really important aspects not just from the patient individual, but from the public health perspective. So we've heard opening statements that take us all the way from study design, intricacies of ensuring good inter-observer variation or reliability. Ashok, I'm going to open it to you to maybe start off the questions. We do also have some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Would you do that?
Yes. My very first question is for Professor Fergus Gleeson. When you say about quantifying professionals and they don't want to be assessed or rated, can we not just have an outside agency or a concept where we know that a model will perform better, and just have an outside standard instead of having a doctor as a standard, or a physician or a sonographer as a standard?
So I think the answer to that is probably. The question is where you set the threshold for what the standard is, and as I said, that is for most areas that's not set. It is for mammography. They know how many interval cancers, and they have a quality control system in place. But mammography is probably as binary as you can get. Well, it's 3 decisions: normal, cancer, or don't know when you do it. So it lends itself to quality control for my areas or sonography. So as a thoracic radiologist, where chest x-ray, the standards for detecting a lung cancer or pneumonia or interstitial disease on a chest x-ray are difficult to measure. And you'd have to determine the prevalence of the disease in your sample set, followed by how you assess how good the radiographers or radiologists or clinicians were at interpretation. I think there should be outside monitoring. I completely agree with you. I think all clinicians of all kinds should be measured against a standard for the work that they do. But as a radiologist, you'll know that on one morning, a radiologist may be interpreting CT scans, and in the afternoon interpreting barium enemas, and then the next day interpreting chest x-rays. Are they going to have to reach the same standard as myself, where I only do a limited number of things? And when you test your algorithm, do you want to test your algorithm against an expert or against someone average, or how do you want to assess it? I think it probably doesn't matter so long as it's overt as to how you've done it, because then the people purchasing it can actually make decisions on whether it's useful for them.
That's a fantastic input, because really, if I have something as binary as a breech presentation versus a cephalic presentation for someone in my far out distance outreach program, then it really becomes binary again. So then my efficiency should be 100%. And if it's a more complicated question, then of course, like what kind of a fetal abnormality, then I have completely different expectations.
Yeah.
But that's I'm going to throw open and get Ram to confuse us all about this in a while. But before we get this to roll further, one question to Alice about what she said. Why can't really their model perform better than the model perform better than a human?
I think it can perform better than a human.
Yes.
I think the question is just how do you actually gauge whether it's better, because we don't have the ground truth in the first place. So I think it's just it's a big challenge in terms of defining what is better. In many ways, certainly at the level we're dealing with at the most, it's a question of sort of what's good enough, and it's more. That's your initial labeling. It's the outcomes then that are more significant in the clinical sense of how is it actually working at a screening level. Ultimately, whether I say that the abdomen of the fetus starts and stops here, and then the pelvis is here, for example, it doesn't really matter so much as are we able from that information to generate a model that is good at occluding fetal genitalia so that you can't detect the genitalia at an ultrasound scan, so that it could be used in an Indian context. So it's sort of trying to work out, actually, does the level of agreement really matter at this stage? Because ultimately we're trying to answer a more clinical, practical question, and at that point a model can absolutely be better than a human can.
I'm going to go to a question from Mohit online, and it's a little bit related to what you've just talked about, Alice, which is the question about false positives. And Mohit's question is, if the problem in screening is about false positive rates, isn't it more important to rule out disease? So isn't it okay to have some false positives as well? Because the whole purpose is to avoid danger. Why do we have to be super accurate? And Mohit, I think the answer lies in the response to what you do to a false positive, in the cost and in the response. And so if the response to an abnormal smear test is a radical hysterectomy the next morning, then your false positive rate of that smear test must be as low as possible, because the cost, the human and the monetary cost of that false positive is very high. If, on the other hand, the response to a false positive abnormal smear test is do another smear in 3 months and see what happens, then actually you can afford to have a slightly higher false positive rate in order to maximize your detection of any disease. So you must remember always this interplay between false positives and detection rates. And that is also important from the perspective of any algorithm. So when we think about algorithmic accuracy, we're talking about the relative merit of detection rate versus false positives. I'm going to go to study design for a second and ask Tavpritesh and Ram about what tools are available to advance. So we're about to design our study. Are there tools available? Are there guidelines available in the literature that can help us, that can guide us to design the study and ensure that we've got good buy-in from clinicians, from patients, or whatever it is that we need to do? There's a lot of boxes to tick. How can we make sure we're ticking them right at the outset?
So yeah, so thank you for the question. I think so. One of the key things in study design and AI algorithms is to clearly understand what our algorithm is expected to do at the end of the day. If it is a longitudinal prediction model, it's a very different situation and a kind of a modeling setup, even in building the cohorts as we actually train the model for this kind of setup, because in that kind of setting, we will be having patients who are not independent of each other. There's repeated measures. And so how do we build cohorts in a way where we are assuming, not assuming independence, and basically developing algorithms in that direction? If it is a cross-sectional study where we are looking at whether a person is giving a diagnosis or a detection, then our study design is obviously going to be different, even from the AI standpoint, which are coming up, even the Equator Tripod ML guidelines and the AI guidelines that are also coming up, now force us more and more to think about what is it exactly that we want to achieve with the algorithm. And even within a single question like prediction, longitudinal prediction of a patient outcome in the future, we need to think about what are the different study designs for the approach that we would be taking. For example, are we going to look at same patient with the possibility of crossing over into sepsis down the line? Or are we looking at a clustering kind of design where we just look at patients who are coming together at a certain point of time, but we don't assume crossover? And are we looking at a continuous time online learning kind of a model where every minute we are spitting out some predictions? Or are we doing a batch processing kind of model where we take some data for the last 12 hours and then we predict an outcome? This is just a very simple example about a longitudinal prediction setting where we do need to understand right from start, what do we want to achieve with the AI model? And that's where clinicians are. I mean, this kind of guidance can only come from clinicians. What is the value or what will be of value for the clinician? If we want an online model and we are building a batch model and a study design doesn't go well with that, we might be going in the completely wrong direction and a huge wasted effort. But I'll stop here just with an example that clinicians and data scientists need to work together to define the study design for the problem and the algorithm together. Thank you.
Aris, you need to unmute.
Ram, over to you, and maybe you can incorporate in your answer the question from Mohit, which is how can we ensure that in our approach to design, we can ensure that the clinicians can also interact? I guess there can be a feeling sometimes that, you know, some of these modeling is driven from the algorithmic perspective and clinicians may not have had the input that they should.
Yeah, I agree. So I agree with most of the points that Dr. Sethi mentioned. I see from my point of view, there are two important tools. One is when you design our study, one has to design the manuscript that's going to come out. As an academic, I would see a manuscript to be ready parallelly, at least the skeleton manuscript. And for that, however evolving the reporting guidelines are, I think reporting guidelines, I think they are the best tools to start when we. That's one. And I think we have separate sessions on reporting guidelines, and so I won't go into details on that. But the second one is one has to visualize as to where this tool is going to fit in the current health system or the treatment protocols that are being followed in different settings. If one doesn't visualize that, and whatever prediction model is going to come out is going to be rather disruptive. And if it is going to be disruptive, it better be the best or the most accurate model. Because if you are not most accurate, if you are not adding value to that level, being disruptive is not going to help that model get translated to clinical practice. So I think for both of this, the approach is, for the second one, the approach is what TP mentioned, which is an interaction with clinicians who work and who are intending to use this model while they are treating their patients. If we are able to envision these two, the academic output as well as how this model is going to be translated and fit into health system, I think the design and the methods will flow through.
Can I come in? It's Fergus. That's great, actually. I think I love the idea that if the model doesn't fit in the current pathway, and is truly disruptive, it had better be the best model there's ever been. It's spot on. For the models to be adopted, the clinical trials have to show how they fit in the workflow. And I think that's a really key component, as opposed to how it just produces an answer, because people will want to know how it fits in the workflow. And I think the idea when you design these is, I've designed a large number of trials, as you can imagine. In the obstetrics, you will get ground truth, but in others areas you needn't, or it may be moot. And one of the things to do is think that you build the model into a workflow at points where there are management decisions for change. And I think if you can build that into your studies, I think that will, and you'll have a better study, you'll get better answers, and you'll get better adoption if the models work. So sorry to interrupt, but I just thought I love the idea. If it's going to be disruptive, it had better be a really good model. I think it's just such a great thought.
You must apologize, Fergus. The intention is exactly this, and like you, I think that's a really nice test in some sense of your model, isn't it? And for those of you who have questions about design, about methodology, but also about, please make sure you join us in about 20 minutes when we have Paula Damon from the Oxford Centre for Statistics and Medicine will be giving a talk on exactly this issue about how we should be designing, how we should be estimating sample size, how we should be reporting also the evaluation of the AI models.
And I'll just interrupt. Interrupt again and say Paula does the stats for my studies, and she's been in contact with me, so she's just terrific. So please do stay and enjoy her talk. Just to promote her as well, she's terrific.
Thank you so much, Ashok.
Yes, I was going to ask Ram another associated question. That Ram, you start out at one point where you're collecting some marvelous data, and you think something will come out of it, and then halfway through you realize that some of the data coming in is really answering questions somewhere else. And your original plan was not so smart and was getting to be a little disruptive or not useful. So then how would you change course halfway through when you hadn't planned it in the first place?
Yeah, yes, I can. There is this always a tension in the mind of a researcher to be, sticking to the a priori design vis-a-vis innovating upon. So I think the type of study will dictate. So if you are doing a validation study, or if you are doing a randomized control trial, you better be, plan it a priori and stick to it, because, you are not changing the goalposts. But if it is going to be exploratory, where you are going to develop a model And there, I think, we should exploit that convenience an observational study or an exploratory study would allow you to. But without, moving away from the larger goal of the group as to what we are looking at, and some kind of goalpost should be already prefixed, which we are not deviating much, but we can certainly innovate upon. If we are going to innovate too much, maybe we could think of another study instead of meddling with what we have already thought of.
Sure.
May I just come in?
Yes, of course.
Please.
Thank you. No, so I think just to add to that, I like to think about AI model development just as the way we think about data science, that there is a stage, the exploratory data analysis stage, and then the next stage of development and validation. So I think completely with the AI approach as well, we sometimes do need to take, and that's what I was intending to say with the first point, that we to build to designing models for questions that we think are important. But there's also a scope and a place for exploratory AI, where the models are not tuned towards a given outcome, and they're essentially tuned towards capturing the let's for the sake of, and so for the lack of better words, capturing the joint probability distribution that could have generated the data, and then letting the clinicians interact with the models, ask questions, query the model, just as the way you would ask an expert. So I think encoding that kind of knowledge into models and then exploring with AI is also an approach that budding modelers could take if we don't have a very focused question right away, and that could help in development of the focused question down the line.
Thank you.
We're doing well. We've got nice questions coming through. We've got about just under over 15 minutes left. I wanted to just very briefly turn to a different area, which is one area is ethics and the other area is regulation. And Fergus and Alice, I will ask you maybe to comment on one of the things that has been worrying me, I guess, to some degree, is about ethical approvals when you're starting a study like this. Ethics boards, in my opinion, are a little bit stuck on p-values and randomized trials still, and often don't get things around big data. So when you go to them and they say, well, what's your sample size? And you say, well, it's not really definable as such. The larger the sample, the better it would be, but we think that this is achievable clinically. They really frown and they don't like that idea at all. And the second, so that was one question I had. And the second question I had is it not possible, do you think, within healthcare systems that we could come up with some method whereby fully anonymized patient data might become available for training algorithms? How difficult do you think that might be to achieve in future? Because most patients, if you ask them, would be perfectly happy to share imaging data or clinical data as long as it's not trackable back to them as individuals, if it's going to lead to improvements in healthcare. Perhaps, Fergus, I'll start with you because you've done so much in this area, and you probably tell me off for being unhappy with my ethics board.
No. Well, first of all, I think that they have a terribly difficult job now. I have to say that things have moved on for ethics panels, and I think that it's very difficult for them, to be frank. A couple of things. The now definitions of anonymized versus pseudonymized. Anonymized is that you may never be able to track back to find out who the patient is. So you have to destroy the relationship between where you got the data from, who from, and the data itself. So that's a high bar. And if you have truly anonymized data, then it's difficult to go back to it. So mostly one settles with pseudonymized. I think the sample size numbers, I completely agree with you. I used to start off my ethics applications, my trial protocols is, we don't know what the number should be. We know large is better. So we're just going to write a large number down. I think we now have got a fair amount of evidence as to where the numbers can take us, at least in my field. So I think I completely agree with you about that. But if you ask a data scientist, they just say more. They just say, just give me more. You know, whatever you got is not enough. So never ask a data scientist that. And then the question of whether we can have large data lakes with truly anonymized data, you can, but before you put the data in, you have to really quality control it. And I had a conversation, I was on a panel yesterday, and I was trying to explain to one of the very brilliant data scientists that actually having all the data from all these patients with lung cancer from across the country would absolutely be hopeless, because they wouldn't know 10 to 20% of patients with a diagnosis of lung cancer where it's on their death certificate don't necessarily have lung cancer. So that's going to really screw their algorithms up, because the patients die without a tissue diagnosis. They have supposed lung cancer, at best intentions, but no one's going to biopsy a 92-year-old who's busy dying. There's no treatment, but they suggest they're a smoker, they've got a hemoptysis and abnormal chest X-ray. So I think very large data lakes that are very carefully quality controlled are not the answer. I think the answer is to have data lakes which are available, but to them is very, very quality controlled, and that would make them much more useful. And then I do think that patients, 98%, we did a survey, 98% of the patients are very happy for their data to be used. They're less keen for Google to own it, one has to be honest. You know, they don't mind Oxford academics and other academics, but they don't want big companies owning their data and making lots of money from it. I'll hand over to you and everyone else now. You're on mute, I think.
Aris, you're muted.
And I guess that can be a problem, because a lot of these developments are happening often between academic institutions and private corporations, or often within private corporations. Yeah, Alice, you recruit patients every day. What's your feeling around this issue of, you know, do you know, have you found much resistance from people sharing their data, for instance, or taking part in studies?
Yeah, I can't give you precise numbers, but I would say the number of women who decide not to take part in the study is very low. But certainly those that do, it is generally because of who's going to have access to the data further down the line. I think people are very comfortable with, oh yeah, if it's just this study, that's okay. But if there's potential that it would get used commercially, they're not so sure about that. But as Professor Gleeson shared, I think the majority of people are very happy for their data to be used sort of indefinitely into the future for things that are going to benefit other patients. And I think Professor Gleeson shared some fantastic points about making sure that these data sets are well controlled. And so we've seen in other areas of healthcare, in obstetrics, and these huge databases in sort of Netherlands, I think, in Sweden, where all women go into this database, no matter what their outcomes are, and you can get fantastic studies out of these, because you don't have to go through lengthy ethics processes every time you want to look at the data. And it would be wonderful if we could have those sorts of things throughout medicine and healthcare, but as Professor Gleeson shared, need to be quality controlled so that you're not just getting all sorts of data that is going to skew models and that sort of thing further down the line.
Ram, did you have the same kind of smooth experience, or was Garbini a lot more bumps on the road?
So in terms of ethics, I think it was when we started Calipers particularly, Before that, it was Garbini, where we had collected numeric data. When it came to ultrasound-based assessments, particularly with ethics committees, it was a constant process of, it was a process of telling them or making them aware of what this entails, what kind of data is being collected, what kind of data management processes are being set up, so that they are assured about integrity and privacy of data. When it came to, with the perspective of participants, at least in low and middle income countries, when the doctors are going to administer the consent forms, there is a lot of a major element of trust is involved in that. And I think that becomes an additional responsibility upon clinician researchers to maintain that trust and to go and take an extra step towards maintaining that trust. And I think if that, whatever be the rules on the books on paper exist, there has to be this moral ensuring privacy of data that is being collected for whatever purpose it is being.
Thank you so much, Ram. This is, I could talk about this stuff all day, and it's so fascinating having you all here. It's a brilliant panel. Tavpritesh, I have a really interesting question from Rahul, who says, given all these difficulties in obtaining data, there's quite a lot of reports, especially in deep learning, about generating synthetic data for purposes of AI. What do you think of this application? Can one generate synthetic images in order to expand the data available for training AI models, or do you just end up with a circular argument where you use data to generate synthetic data that then you learn on?
Certainly, I think so. Some of these arguments about ethics some companies have come up, and a lot of research has gone into generating synthetic data sets, because we have had a lot of success with the generative models, especially in the imaging space. So I think in the imaging space, this does seem to be a slightly more mature technology, where if we have large databases to train with, the rider being that we should have initially large data sets to train with. So it does not mitigate the challenge of not having a large enough database initially to train with, because these models are data hungry. They do mitigate the challenge of sharing data, because once you, for example, have trained on large data sets and are able to capture those nooks and crannies of the distribution in terms of are we actually sampling all the underrepresented populations, or are we sampling all these unique nuanced patient populations and so on, then of course the ethics challenge about sharing data with generative data modeling becomes simpler. But if we think about generative models as an approach that can remove the need for a large enough representative data set to begin with, that I think is not happening right now, at least as we know as of now. So my short take is yes, for the purpose of data sharing and doing away with the ethical challenges, generative models, especially in the imaging space, are a good approach. But these are extensively expensive to train upon as well. So keep that also in mind while you are building these models.
And Fergus, in your experience, do you think from the regulatory perspective, and I did want to come to regulatory approval of whatever product it is you want to create, at the time of designing your study, making sure that your pathway, if you like, includes all the steps? How can we make sure that the regulatory approvals process that changes over time is taken into account when we design our study? And do you think that such generative data could ever meet the criteria set by regulators?
So I can't answer the latter because I haven't got enough experience in it, I'm afraid. So I think I will have to defer to the data scientists as to how valid the synthetic data is. Certainly in terms of regulatory approval, the regulators have got becoming much smarter about looking at the data collected. And one of the examples was one of the algorithms, so again, it has to be thoracic, I'm afraid, but it doesn't make the point, was on pneumothoraces, and they didn't actually ask how big the pneumothorax was, whether there was underlying lung disease, because they didn't have enough experience. And now, going back to them with new models for pneumothoraces, they're very keen to know how big or small the pneumothorax is, whether there's associated lung disease that'll make it difficult. So I think about now, going back to my point at the beginning, as though the algorithms were pharmaceuticals, the one difference that the AI world has not really caught up with, I'm sure the panelists are on board with this, but the AI world and the regulators, is that the algorithms developed are a snapshot in time from data. And actually, that's not what happens with technology. Technology improves and pathways change. And so we need to think about how we would build updating of an improvement of algorithms because of changes in technology, as opposed to having an algorithm that was developed on data that's 10 years old, because the world has moved on. And that has not been solved by the regulators, and they're very unkeen on continuous learning.
But knowing that not all regulators are consistent, do you think it would be ethical to dress things up and seduce them more easily?
I'm not going to answer that on the grounds I might incriminate myself.
So very, very important then for also for our delegates to understand that currently models have to be frozen in time to the regulator, and then they are done. And you can of course update them, but that has to happen on an interval basis with further approval. There is no process at the moment, or there are no algorithms at the moment that continuously learn from data that are accruing in real time, as you and I would learn as clinicians. And that is an important limitation. We're almost out of time. We've got just a couple of minutes left. So maybe I thought I would just throw open the floor to any other things that people have a burning desire to tell us that they think we haven't covered. And also, just very briefly, I might get you all to give me a big smile, and I'm going to capture a picture for Twitter. Thank you.
I just thought I would add, because I'm not sure that any of us specifically mentioned it, but there are now reporting guidelines for AI work. So the claim guideline is sort of best one for working in AI, and it's really helpful if you are aware of that. I think when we started out, it still hadn't been published, but to be aware of those guidelines before you start and really work through in your study design and planning what you're going to do over the next few years of your research, to make sure that you really have got to grips with those guidelines, and getting a protocol paper sorted so that you can refer back to that. There's a huge amount of information that the claim guidelines are asking for that can't easily be fitted into one manuscript. So think about that early on in your study planning.
Thank you. Ashok, close the session and thank everyone.
Well, of course, because there's a lot to thank for. We've got the ball rolling for the rest of the day today, and we've had some absolutely very, very simple sounding inputs, but which were very complex and yet conveyed the message that we should to the audience that we have. We have a mixed audience today, and we've taken them from A to Z without too much of difficulty. And I really like to thank all our panels here, and you, Aris, for having all this working out so well. Thank you indeed.